So we're at the very end of our program, and I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, another colleague of mine, Kelly Clifton. Kelly's a professor and the Bombardier Chair of Regional Transportation Planning, Community and Regional Planning at UBC. And Kelly works on the intersection of transportation, land use, and human behavior. We've given Kelly the very simple task of sharing with us her views on the future of transportation. Kelly.
Thanks, everyone, for sticking around. So here we are at the end. What's left to say? So my background is not in air quality. My background is in travel behavior. So I think about what the drivers and conditions that shape our transportation decisions and our activity decisions. And so my perspective is probably a little bit different than most of the things that you've heard about today. So at the end, again, small task, 20 minutes, talk about the future of transportation. And so I'm hoping at least to have a vision. I don't know if it's profound. I'm going to proselytize a little bit. And because I'm talking about the future, I don't have any data, right? So I can make it up. And so I'm hoping to maybe be positive. So as a planner, we think about the future, and so we think about making a better future. Right? We want the future to be better than today. We want to address the ills of today. But we also want to make sure that we don't fix yesterday's problem tomorrow, that we are anticipating and remedying other problems as they appear. So a vision for a better future. So I was asked to talk about four things, really. Innovations that I think are going to influence the transportation of the future. And I've picked some things that maybe we haven't talked about so much today, and a couple that we have. What is I'm going to emphasize my vision of an ideal transportation system, one that is sustainable and healthful, and I would also add equitable and economical. Talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we're going to encounter in achieving my vision, and a nod to policies that might get us there. And then equity. So I have 20 minutes. I'm not going to get to any of this with any sort of depth, so you'll just have to talk to me later if you want depth. So I've been asked to talk about the future. So let's see. Is it just slow? Do I have to point it? Point it where? Point it here? Yeah. All right, so I've been talking about the future, so I'm going to talk about the past. So does anyone want to take a gander about what the oldest transportation technology is? Alex? Feet. Yeah, shoes. I'm going to say shoes. Yeah, shoes. So I'm really looking forward to my shoe subsidy, because I like them a lot. So looking back, and so not only am I going to talk about the past, which you didn't ask me to talk about, I'm going to talk about dang it, it's my timing. My comedic timing is going to be off here. I'm going to talk about myself. So as I was thinking about all these things that are happening in the future, I couldn't help but think about all the things that have happened in my lifetime in terms of shaping transportation in the past. So I'm 54 years old, so I was born in 1968. So at least on this timeline, I've been walking almost my entire life. And I bet you guys have too. So what happened not long after that, we went to the moon, and that was really influential actually in the trajectory of technologies I'm going to talk about in the last 54 years. So we landed on the moon, also very influential in my own career path in mechanical engineering. I was super jazzed about space exploration. When I was a kid, there was the oil crisis of 1973 and an energy crisis of 1977, and we started to see a collective consciousness around the cost of transportation, the size of vehicles, and people thinking differently about their behavior. About that time, I learned how to ride a bike, so almost my whole life I've also been riding a bike. Seatbelt laws. So again, a thing that we probably don't, we take for granted now, but the first seatbelt law in Canada was 1977. So it's been with us a while, and look how we've changed our behavior there. But hard to imagine that vehicles didn't have seatbelts at a particular time. The first personal computer was on the market about 1977, so that's a Commodore PET, I believe. The CD-ROM, we don't use those so much anymore, but also technology that's maybe come and go, but maybe coming back, at least in terms of music, that never seems to die. The first minivan, so the Dodge Caravan, was put on the market and really changed. So all those small vehicles that we were thinking about in the 70s changed, and this really led to, I think, the SUV of today, which I think, not too long ago, about 2015, became the most dominant vehicle in the market, were SUVs. Also that year, the first mobile phone weighed about 2 pounds. So again, you think about those technological changes, having to carry that around with you. Big thing that changed our lives is voicemail answering machines. So in 1984, answering machines only had sold about 1 million in the United States. So think about if you needed to make a call or contact someone prior to that, you actually had to catch them at home or at work where their phone was. And you couldn't even leave them a message, you just had to call back. So how does that change our activity and travel? Well, it means that we can get information, we can coordinate with others anytime we want now. In 1986, I went to undergraduate at West Virginia University, where I had the unusual experience of being able to ride an automated, on-demand personal rapid transit every day to an engineering building. So we have this unusual vehicle of the future that I started riding in 1986 as a mechanical engineering student. The first pedal assist bike was developed in 1989. So again, Alex talked a lot about micromobility, so the sort of inception of some of those vehicles happened in my lifetime. TomTom, so navigation. Anybody here remember MapQuest, when you wanted to travel and you had to print out sheets and sheets and sheets of directions? So TomTom, where did that come from? Well, some of that space exploration and satellites helped our telecommunications and helped our GPS. So my first email address was when I went to do my master's degree, at least my first email address that wasn't on an internal LAN system. So 1984, I had email. So really, email hasn't been with us all of our lives. Really fascinating to think about now. Amazon, 1984. Also, the first car share in North America was in Quebec City, I think called Commu Auto. The first Prius, 1997, was sold in Japan. Bluetooth, not too long after that. Laptop computer, so the Mac iBook, 1999. Skype, precursor to Zoom. We all love that now. Love it. Love it. Google Maps. So if we're freed from MapQuest, we can now figure out where to go right on our phones. And there's our phone. So the first iPhone, 2007. Tesla started manufacturing the Roadster in 2008, and I think they had 148 electric vehicles. Uber was founded in 2009, and then the first bike share in Montreal, Bixi, was started. Fitbit, so being able to keep track of your steps and your personal mobility and other data about yourself, was started in 2014. Lime and Bird started the electric scooters and scooter sharing. In 2018, you could take a Waymo One, which is a driverless taxi in Phoenix if you dared, and I think you can still do that. And then in 2020, the Starship started these little mobile delivery things in the UK, and they're on many US and campuses around the world doing automated delivery of goods. Okay, that's in my lifetime. So if I'm supposed to talk about the future, I have no idea what's going to happen in the future, because just look at this incredible trajectory of of technologies and how they've had an influence on us. But I think the takeaway point here is, first of all, one, we have no idea. Two, there still is a path dependency. So the decision to explore space led to a lot of these technologies and enabled us to think differently about our travel. So when we start talking about the technologies today, so talking about electric vehicles, talking about micromobility, they are going to set in motion a whole set of decisions for us in our future. And I think the other point that I want to make is, but we have agency about how we use those technologies. That it isn't just sort of some technological determinism that we have electric vehicles or we have micromobility and that we have to use it. So we, as government agencies, as industries, and as private individuals, have choices, and we have influence on how these things get deployed and whether we choose to accept them or not. So I think that's critical, at least for my vision of the future. Okay, so looking ahead, again, I just want to say we don't have a technological determinism that we have both, but we do have opportunities and threats to think about. And so again, I'm just going to talk about a few of these technologies of the future, not all of them. This one's been talked about a ton today, so vehicle electrification. I just want to emphasize here that the nice thing about electric vehicles is it sort of relaxes what that vehicle body type looks like, and that we have a lot of flexibility to design vehicles that fit on smaller streets, that perform different functions, that look very differently than they do today. And we can, whether we're talking about micromobility, whether we're talking about buses, freight, all kinds of specialized purposes, so that we aren't constrained in our thinking about what a vehicle looks like today. And Petter talked about this in his talk earlier. So some of the challenges, I think many of us have already heard this today, but I think in particular thinking about energy production and distribution. So yeah, we want to switch to these things, but does our energy system actually have the capacity to handle a mass migration to EVs? And I would say here that industry is already on board. So the vehicle manufacturers are already on board with this. They have made announcements about not producing internal combustion engines, what their projected fleets are. And so we need to think about the infrastructure to support those different types of vehicles and think about how we as a people want to adopt them for use. And I think there's huge equity issues here in terms of legacy vehicles and access to them, and Ms. Vieira talked about those somewhat in her presentation. But the other thing that we know is electric vehicles aren't going to save us. We heard that clearly today. There are clear environmental impacts that are as bad, perhaps, for us as internal combustion engines, and so the future is going to tell what those are. And so we have to be very cautious. They also have social and health impacts. So what are they, and how do we think very carefully about what we're forging into the future? So another technology that we talked about a little bit, so Marianne brought this up just lightly in her talk earlier, about automation and connectedness of vehicles. And so this is more than just thinking about driverless vehicles. Our vehicle fleets have been moving towards automation slowly. It's an evolutionary process. It's not going to be like, boom, automatically we have a driverless vehicle. That we've been slowly ceding control of different aspects to the vehicle and to different technologies over time. So cruise control being a very early automation that's happening in the vehicle. And so we are told that these improvements are going to help us in terms of safety and in terms of efficiency, in terms of fuel economy, in terms of thinking about crashes, preventing crashes and overcoming the human element. But again, most of these improvements are still firmly entrenched in automobility. They have advantages in terms of freight and delivery, and I believe also in transit. So thinking back to my PRT days, it can help think about the operating costs of things like transit. But I think there's also a cost to thinking, again, that automation is going to make transit cheap. The drivers of transit vehicles do much more than just drive. They give directions, they give assistance, they help passengers out. And so we can't just think about removing the human element from our vehicle fleet. Also, automation and connectedness give us information, so information about our environment and feedback that we're going to have in terms of moving through urban systems. Something that we didn't talk about at all today is the future of work. And so it's a big topic amongst travel demand researchers, is where and how much will we be working in the future. And that has a lot of impact on our travel demand. So as we saw during the pandemic, a lot of people worked from home, and a lot of people really liked working from home, and a lot of businesses liked us from working from home. And so this is, I would say, a position that's in flux right now. Where will we be working in the future? Will we be working a 32-hour work week, as some have proposed, and California is considering that? Are we going to work till we're 32 or 62 or 64? I mean, France is sort of having that debate right now. But we have to remember that not everybody can have a choice for where they work. They didn't during the pandemic, and they won't in the future. And so I think the thing that we want to think about in terms of the future is there going to be a big reshuffling or a big shuffling of land uses and where people are positioned and where firms are going to locate and where offices are going to locate. So I think the other thing that we know from working from home is that we also shift that travel to other things. So just because we're not commuting, we spend that time then doing other kinds of travel, like non-work travel, which is much harder to predict and much harder to understand in terms of how to meet those needs. Okay, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and augmented reality. So this is sort of far out science fiction kinds of things. But it's here, and people are talking about it, and it's going to have an important role in both our work and our leisure time. In terms of artificial intelligence, it's already here, and thinking about the algorithms and the decisions that we have to make and that we off-put to other processes. But AI also tells us about things, what do we have access to? It affects how we have access to things and opportunities and information and what we know. And there's huge equity implications about how artificial intelligence is developed and how it's deployed. In terms of virtual reality, it's enhancing, currently I think we're thinking about it in terms of enhancing our online experience, so creating digital twins, creating kinds of environments so that we can all be virtually, we can be far apart, we don't have to be proximate, but we have an enhanced experience in terms of our online world. And so whether the metaverse comes into play or not, I'm not so sure, but we have to pay attention to these things. And I think augmented reality is the thing that's going to enhance perhaps our real life experience. And again, this question of enhanced for who and in what ways. And the one thing that I do know about our online experience that evidence shows is the more we are online, the more we consume. And so we can have an impact there on our travel demand, even if we ourselves are not traveling. And then the other thing to be aware of is maybe the cognitive dissonance between ourselves and our environment and our impact and our interaction with each other. So the less we are interacting in real life, maybe the more disposed we are to care less about the things around us. Okay, so enough about future technologies. Let's talk a little bit about my vision. And my vision actually was nicely already sort of conceptualized in the Vancouver 2040 plan, which talked about prioritizing pedestrians at the top and private auto at the bottom, right? And so active transportation is really where we want to make our investments. And cars are going to be like sugar in our diet. We just want to use them sparingly and as needed and maybe as a treat. And so here the question is, how do we implement this? So if these are the goals, then how do we get there? And again, I have a lot more questions probably than answers, but things to consider. So the first thing is the primacy of the pedestrian. So if this is at the top of the food chain, the thing that we need to think about first and foremost, how is that actually reflected other than in goals? So if we look at our budgets and where we're spending money, does it actually show up as at the top? And I would say across the jurisdictional strata, it does not. So we're not necessarily putting our money where our mouth was in terms of investment in pedestrians. Walking is the one characteristic or a characteristic that distinguishes us as human beings from other animals in the environment. So our ability to walk, there's a lot of evidence that our brain has developed at the speed of walking. It has developed to intake information about the environment at the speed of moving through the environment at walking speed. We know that it's good for our physical health. We know that it's good for our mental health. We know that it's a social activity. It's resilient. It's cheap. It's equitable. Why not? It makes all the sense. So we have to put people at the centers of our measures, our design, and our budget and our money. A cycling revolution. So again, Alex added to this micromobility and e-bikes. And the nice thing about cycling, and another thing, and as we think about this transition that needs to take place, is it helps overcome some of the distance barriers that some of our land use maybe isn't caught up if we're thinking about more suburban environments, that cycling allows us to go farther than we can with walking. It serves lower density. And then electrification and micromobility help us overcome topographical challenges, age and ability challenges. So it's a great vehicle to think about also investing in. I'm not going to prolong that, but. And then again, transit. So it should, again, be at the core of our regional infrastructure. So we're not all going to live our lives only within walking and cycling distances of our homes. But transit can take very different forms, and so high-speed rail transit, it's expensive, and it takes a really long time to build. But there's lots of interim measures, so bus rapid transit in the interim is a great stopgap. And transit right now is really threatened, so Marianne talked about this in the very beginning. It's threatened in particular in places that have been very successful with transit because fare box recovery is a larger percentage of operating costs. So since the pandemic, we know that ridership in most places is down. So how do we compensate for that and think about putting our subsidies into transit? We can't do any of this without land use planning, so it's more than just density, diversity, and design, which we talk a lot about in the planning field. We also have to think about affordability, so who can live where? What kind of housing are we putting in these places? We also have to think about the economics of this. So if we are talking about smaller stores, neighborhood-based economy, then we have to think about how those can be competitive in a world of big multinational retailers. Again, I think land use might be undergoing a big rearrangement. So again, thinking about the relationship between home and work locations. And so how do we take advantage of this? The other thing is that, there's a great conceptualization called this 15-minute neighborhood that is right now the very big hot topic in urban planning. It also has been politicized recently, so it's great to know that when Fox News talks about 15-minute neighborhood as a tool of the right, that you've arrived. So I sent that to my mom. Mom, look. Okay, so how do we get there? Well, I think it's going to take a massive amount of change, and we're going to have to change our approach to transportation. So the status quo is not going to get us there, and the status quo across the board, like from methods to who's engaged in transportation. And so the first thing I think is the transportation workforce. So in North America, the transportation workforce is largely male, it's largely white, it's largely cisgender, it's largely straight, and able-bodied. And there's nothing wrong with being in that demographic bucket. But if we're going to design transportation systems for everyone, we need to have our transportation workforce look like everyone and solicit ideas from everyone. So we need more representation, and that's partially on me as an academic to recruit more people into transportation. But I think it's on all of us to think about the fields that we encourage our children to go into, because we really do need fresh and new ideas if we're going to make these big changes. So rethinking the right of way. So what is this? I think Alex talked about this a little bit when he was talking about the different kinds of vehicles and the different speeds and the different capabilities all sharing space. So we need to really think about how we're allocating street space And by right of way, I mean not just the physical curb to curb, but also sidewalk to sidewalk. So how are we allocating that space? Are we allocating that space to the modes that we want to encourage? Are we thinking about humans and people as at the center of the metrics we're using to evaluate performance? So in automobility, our metrics are still based on throughput, are based on speed, congestion, measures of delay. And so as long as we're thinking about our streets as places to move through, we're ignoring the fact that these are social spaces. They're places where we access businesses. Here in Vancouver, they are spaces where people sleep on the street. So how do we totally rethink how we're using this road space? Because I think it's fundamental. So I could go on and on, but I won't. Okay, and then equity issues. So I've touched on some of these. Well, no, I do want to go back and say something else. I think we have to have these performance measures based on people, but what if we also had performance standards based on emissions? What if we had a cap on emissions standards for a particular street segment? What if we had an energy consumption cap? So how much energy are we willing to expend to have people move through a particular space? So I think, rethinking our performance measures, rethinking our transportation science, our traffic science, all of that needs sort of a big rethink. Then in terms of equity, the poor require more mobility. They require more time and resources to carry out their daily activities. So I just looked up what the average cost of a new vehicle is in Canada. It's $60,000. And the average cost of a used vehicle in Canada is $35,000. That's a lot of capital to use a public infrastructure. So we're asking people not just to invest in the operating cost. That doesn't include the operating cost. That's just the capital you need to move around in our region. So is that really in the tenor of what public infrastructure is? So when we think about equity, we have to think about that they have less choices in mode. As we are talking about moving to zero emission vehicles and we are thinking about retiring internal combustion engines, vehicles that we know that this population is going to be impacted the most, they're more likely to be the last ones to be able to afford an electric vehicle, and they will probably be paying higher and higher operating costs as carbon taxes get higher and higher on fuel. They also have fewer housing choices, so much of our transportation choices are set by where we live, so we in transportation need more and more to be thinking about land use and to be engaged with housing. Commuting, again, this is a population that is more likely to have to commute, that has fewer choices about working from home, and they also have less access to goods and services and less ability to shift to online. So how do we want to frame a society for these people and make sure that our transportation system, again, is equitable, sustainable, healthful, and economical? Okay, and then my last slide. We talk a lot about mobility and access. Transportation is really just a derived demand, and it's just there to get us to our destination. And so then we just want to get from A to B as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible, as economically as possible. But right now, on average in Canada, we spend about an hour a day in our commutes, and that's just in our commutes, not all the travel that we do. And that's a lot of our waking hours. And so we have to think about what experiences are we having when we travel. So what kind of mood, how is it affecting our mood? How is it affecting our well-being? How is that experience that we're having? It matters. And I think in particular, if we expect people to change modes, it's going to have to be pleasant. And more importantly, it probably should be fun. So having fun as a performance measure, I think, would be a fantastic way to start rethinking our transportation system. Okay, I said I was going to proselytize. That's the end of it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kelly. Fantastic way to close our workshop, but we do have time for questions and would encourage you to ask them. A lot of room, food for thought here. In the back, maybe. Sorry.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. That was very, very thought-provoking, very interesting. I have a million questions, but I'll only ask one of them. Your discussion around transportation equity is very, very, very relevant. Even when we look at the dollars, when you're talking about, the amount of money we pay for maintaining road infrastructure for a vehicle stock that already costs us so much money, that's just insane, right? And when you look at the health benefits that transportation could provide us, the benefits in dollar value associated with that will outweigh any transit subsidy that we do, like healthcare costs. This is where the big dollars are, not even, faring to transit. And I was wondering whether you had any information regarding, the impacts of subsidizing transit for mobility poor individuals. This information about that trip that is not taken, right? We tend to think about, that $3.7 fare, and we don't think that we will ever forgo an essential trip because of the transit fare. But for some people, it must matter. And I was wondering whether you had any information about, essential trips not being taken because of transit fares.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So to your first point in terms of thinking about health, one of the points I wanted to make in rethinking our workforce is we need to also be interdisciplinary. So we need to engage with health professions, we need designers, we need psychologists, we need everybody engaged in this question. To your question about immobility or suppressed mobility, I think this is really the next area we need to think about investing in data. So I've said for a long time, as a transportation modeler, I'm modeling 0 trips, and on the positive end of the scale, we really don't know about the negative end of the scale, right? So whose needs are unmet. We just know that they didn't make a trip, but we don't know. Or we know that they made 3 trips, but maybe they needed to make 6. So no, I don't necessarily know that piece. And then in terms of subsidy, when I left Portland, there was a pilot program happening called the Transportation Wallet that was for residents of affordable housing that gave free transit passes, gave a flexible amount of a free membership to bike share and car share, and then a flexible amount of cash that could be used to move between those things. So sort of understanding that there was a certain level of mobility, almost like an earned income tax credit. So could we give a mobility credit to people who are means tested to facilitate not just moving around by transit, but also being able to have access to a car when needed. And that was that was being evaluated. And then there was also a similar program being evaluated for higher income residents of our most dense neighborhood. If they gave up their residential parking pass, they would also have access to this. So, so stay tuned or look at my former colleagues at Portland State to see how that happened. But I think that that's an idea that's really worth examining and then understanding how it could scale and what the costs are and then the benefits to health.
So I'm going to take Chair's prerogative to ask you a question also. One of the things we haven't talked about a lot today, but that's a really important trend, is the aging of our population. So I wonder where that fits into your vision. Do we need, a different vision, or how does that filter through kind of the, the priorities that you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think the other thing about an aging population is that they're very, very heterogeneous, right? They have different abilities, different capabilities, different incomes, and different desires. So, things like e-bikes obviously are, I think, at least it seems to me that higher income, older persons are adopting them at a higher rate than we expected. But again, this is a thing that we have to sort of pay attention to because there's efforts to have people age in place so that their community is there for them. But then a lot of those places are not very accessible to transition away from driving if that was their previous behavior. So again, I think we need to engage senior populations in our transportation planning process.
Great presentation, thank you. I really appreciated the thoughts about the agency we have in the future path and the importance of aligning our actions and our budgets with our values. But I wanted to ask if you could give us your thoughts on the future of transportation in a changed climate and some maybe considerations there.
Change climate. So, yeah. I mean, I think the planet's going to get hotter, right? And maybe wetter in places. And so, is that what you're talking about, or a changed political climate? I want to make sure you're talking about environmental climate. Yeah, okay. Whew. All right. Yeah, so I think that we're going to have to make a lot more, pay a lot more attention to greening and shade. So if we want people to engage in active transportation, we need to give them relief from the elements. I think that in terms of how we think about approaching climate change and resiliency, again, I think that active transportation probably is it is the better route to go. I don't think that we can sustain like the planet being reliant on automobility, even if energy were free and cheap, right? I think that there's just limits to the consequences for society and in the environment, even if we're not talking about energy consumption. I don't know if you have a specific.
Kelly, thank you. That was awesome. I wanted your thoughts or vision on sort of the ubiquitous sensing that we now have in all cars and computing in relation to sort of like, in smart cities and kind of all that data transmission. I know insurance companies, for example, rely on a lot of those sensors to, cut costs and whatever. But like in your ideal vision, right, all these sensor networks, regardless of autonomous driving and connectivity and smart city kinds of sensors and IoT hubs, what's the big vision there?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a big vision about everything having a sensor. Yeah, I think that industry has a big vision about deploying sensors and the Internet of Things. I have yet to see a lot of innovation on how smart cities is enhancing the pedestrian experience or the cycling experience, or safety, yeah. I think that there's a lot of opportunity to think about things like lighting at night, so having energy savings lighting that are only activated when there's movement or people in the space. I think we could think about, so you were talking about having air quality sensors, and so giving people feedback about what kinds of environments they're moving in, I think has a really big impact on then their political agency to ask for different things. So I think it's about their knowledge and their understanding of the problems helps shift then I think our ability to execute that vision.
This might be a half-baked question, but I guess thinking about the need to shift our modes and just I liked what you had to say about needing to change the transportation workforce, but how do we change the standards by which people feel, or the guidelines by which people feel like they need to abide by, particularly in engineering? I mean, for us, we come across a lot of issues with the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure, for example, when a crossing is not warranted. Right, and I think like some of those standards are really going to have to change in order to really achieve what we're trying to get here. And I think like everybody in this room is probably quite on board, right? But like there's obviously a whole transportation sector that's not here.
Yep.
That needs to adjust that frame.
Yeah, so how do we change the data and metrics and methods in which we design and plan our infrastructure? And I think a couple things about that. So I would just, again, if we go back to me in my lifetime, I've seen tremendous change in the workforce, and I've seen tremendous change in how cities are thinking about transportation. So if you look at the transformation that New York City undertook under the leadership of Jeanette City-Khan, if you look at what's happening in Los Angeles, and there's so much happening in Los Angeles that's harder to see, but it's really transformative. So I think one thing, that's a product of sort of my generation, right? So the education that I had thinking about land use, thinking about active transportation, having more women in the field, and then cities not having any money, the convergence of those things led to change and innovation. So I can only be hopeful that the students that I'm educating and the other faculty in the room are educating, if we're on board, that these changes are going to happen in that workforce. So I find that the students I have now, they're already on board with this, right? They're already asking those questions and thinking about those things. The question is, can we wait for them to get out there? But I think that there's probably a lot of insurgent interest, but people are moving up the power structure, right? And so part of it is waiting until people have agency to make change. But that's a half-baked answer, but I think that I think we have to rethink all of it. So, yeah.
So I think we'll close there. Thanks very much, Kelly.
Thank you.
I really appreciate